As you all know, Kara and I, and many of you, are working on the Regional Resilience Action Plan. We've had 2 chapter meetings already. There's actually 5 structured chapters. First one is really on the climate science and risks and future conditions, hazards. Second one will focus on the actual details of the social demographics and community vulnerability, and including housing vulnerability in this piece. And so we're appreciating all the resources we're getting from the Florida Housing Coalition, UF, Schimberg Center, and also USF is working on that. We'll talk more about some of the REACH pieces and how they fit in. The chapter on people and place and prosperity, I want to briefly speak to that because there is, we see a clear opportunity for weaving in equity, both in the planning process, as Laura mentioned, as well as the language with the careful attention to language, and then engaging communities through the voice of that. So people is really what Hank spoke to is we feel and see, and this is the input we've received, is a need for capacity building amongst the community for knowledge and also strategic leadership related to governance and institutionalizing certain kind of approaches. So place is your sort of prototypical where the adaptation strategies for a whole community approach to resiliency will live. And that covers aspects from ecosystems to housing to infrastructure. And then prosperity, lastly, is supported through a lot of the economic development administration goals that we have. So both taking stock of potential resilience impacts to key industry sectors. So tourism, as an example, which is also a major employer for many, has many of the low income and hospitality jobs. So things that happen and go wrong to certain sectors also have the potential to impact a lot of our community in terms of lost jobs and wages and their own economic resiliency. So over the next 3 months, we'll be hosting the next series of workshops. In January, the Management and Planning Committee, which is the Resilience Leads liaison to the coalition, will have a meeting as well. And then the date, I think we said we're saving a date soon. So next screen, please. So one of the things that I wanted to let everybody know that we will have as a tool and a part of our collaboration for this information as well going forward is community engagement platform. We've just signed a contract to use MetroQuest next year, which is an online tool that some of the MPOs have used in the region. And this will really help us to take stock of some of these priorities and goals we have and really get community input on them. And this will, because it's supported by the Chase grant in this context, it will really focus a lot on housing in neighborhoods and resiliency and equity and amenity questions related to that. Of course, we recognize we've got to figure out these other engagement strategies to be able to reach the key communities we need to get to. And as the Regional Planning Council, it's not like we go out and we outreach to communities, but we work with our local government partners. It's really your local initiatives and our collaborating activities with United Way, for example. So we'll be probably setting up a community engagement working group to really plan this one out and how equity, the fact that we have MetroQuest for an entire year enables us to do as many surveys as we wish. So you get recommendations to do multiple short ones, and it's not going to have a lot of technical wonky planning language. So you have my commitment to that. So just very excited that we have this tool to use for us. So next screen. So many of you have heard us talk about REACH, funded by JP Morgan Chase. I just wanted to briefly show the screens on this, which is, it is really about the process of driving consistent approaches and using different frameworks, creating new tools to do that, making sure that we have standards and metrics that we can all agree to. And here's the long list of activities that the logos on the right, again, the UF Schimberg Center, so Andrea and Bill, Florida Housing Coalition, the United Way, Taryn's group, USF's and Doug's group. So we have an amazingly strong group of collaborator partners on this project. And over the next year and a half, this goes through May of 2022. So We've already been reaching out to local government, resilience and housing experts to get input on a variety of things, and the program will really grow a lot faster in mid-21 through a lot of different initiatives. But next screen, please. What we're doing is we're actually embedding questions of equity and metrics throughout the tools that are being produced for REACH. So USF is the lead on helping us develop this community vulnerability assessment methodology and user guide, which is really, we've had many questions about different data sets, different combined data layers to answer key questions such as where is housing in relation to transportation, but now also equity in relation to extremely busy highways, which may contribute to health issues because of particulate matter and air pollution. So thank you to Daphne and Caitlin and others at the Health and All Policies group. We've really begun to, the Regional Planning Council has really begun to learn and see how Health and All Policies fits clearly in this aspect of equity and resilience. Separately, the other folks, so the Florida Housing Coalition has been helping to, and some of you have participated in, constructing a housing and resilience plan crosswalk. So what do our comp plans say now about resilience in terms of mitigation, planning, avoiding, documenting, etc.? And this tool, we went through a couple of input meetings in late October, and the plan is to roll that out in late January with a series of webinars. And it's really going to be a team approach, and we'll be very excited because there'll be a lot of support from technical assistance for the folks on that. Additionally, University of Florida, Bill's team has already created a coastal flood risk housing mapper that uses a lot of the data that they manage through their center. And we are working with them to regionalize it, to embed our scenarios that we would be using, and lots of good data. And they'll produce a lot of assessments and working with us in the different counties so we can begin to take stock of the issues of typology and age and the combined components of risk. So short-term risks that are episodic, like hurricanes, versus chronic and ongoing risks associated with future sea level rise. So really embedding equity in our questions and looking at these tools as ways to help us answer some questions about what's at stake and how will it impact certain communities of color and low income. So I think that's it for me in that quick update. So now Simone, who's our NAS fellow, is going to talk about some of the things that she's been working on since she arrived in September.
Thanks, EJ. So the work that I've been doing at the Regional Planning Council since my fellowship started was collecting more than 30 plus frameworks, reports, white papers that provide recommendation and models for how to best integrate health, equity, and resilience into community resiliency and planning. These frameworks were organized in a spreadsheet, which I have a screenshot of here, and the categories from this framework range from health and equity, housing resilience, and climate justice and community resiliency. And out of the 30 plus frameworks, I recommended the Regional Planning Council and the region follow about 2 or 3 of them. But today I'll be referring from one of them, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network that Laura mentioned earlier. And they provide information on equitable climate preparedness planning, which I'll be talking about a lot from today. Next slide, please. So as we know, there are a number of social determinants that affect community resiliency. To summarize a little what I'll be covering today, we know that 1, racial and social inequities will be exacerbated by climate change. 2, health and environmental justice are the forerunners of resilience. And 3, affordable housing gaps affect generational wealth and how well we're able to recover from extreme weather events. The figure on the right emphasizes other social determinants or factors that can affect these inequities. Communities of color, low moderate income communities are often burdened with multiple social determinants and overlapping factors that impact their ability to adapt to climate change. And racism is a key factor influencing climate vulnerability. Structural and institutional racism in our economic, government, and social systems has resulted and continues to result in disproportionate distribution of these burdens. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to define a few terms that we come across a lot when we're referencing equity. The first is frontline communities. These frontline communities are those that experience the first and worst consequences of climate change, predominantly among communities of color and low income. And these neighborhoods often lack basic infrastructure to support these as the climate deteriorates. Second, institutional racism. This looks like individuals with their own personal assumption about race take on the power of the institution when they act in ways that advantage and disadvantage people based on race. Examples of this include discriminatory treatment and inequitable opportunities. And structural racism normalizes and reinforces existing dynamics that routinely advantage white people while producing chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. One example of this is the demolition of neighborhoods of color, which causes pushes of concentrated people of color into disadvantaged neighborhoods. The root causes of inequities that increase the front lines communities' sensitivity results from institutional and structural racism, which affects policymaking and how decisions are made. The reason we should understand these terms because institutions and structural systems are social determinants that drive outcomes of resilience. Next slide, please. So resilience planning and the goals that we want to discuss today needs to address inequity using a systems approach. I'll be referencing from the USDN framework, and they further define and characterize equity into three objectives: procedural, distributional, and structural. These three objectives represent different dimensions of equity, each requiring distinctive strategies to be achieved. So previous discrimination or shortcomings must be acknowledged and addressed through the planning process to move forward. Procedural equity objectives encourage planners to create processes that are transparent. Strategies to attain distributional and structural equity are also required to ensure that outcomes are fair and the root causes of inequities are addressed through improved government processes. Next slide. The USDN also recommends planning had 6 characteristics to ensure climate preparedness is equitable. These characteristics incorporate the equity objectives I just previously mentioned. The first is to actively identify inequities during the planning process. 2, engage with communities most impacted through collaborative partnerships. 3, promote democracy and transparency in government by supporting equitable decision-making. 4, address inequities by adapting strategies developed in partnership with these communities. And also strategies should be focused on deriving multiple co-benefits. 5, support integrative government, which is processes such as the whole systems approach, which is what the HIAP initiative is. And 6, foster sustainability by considering current and future climate change impacts. So I'm going to be talking about 2 models the USDN recommends, which provides a structure for understanding equity and how government institutions can improve equitable outcomes through decision-making. Next slide. The framework for the institutionalization of racial equity goes on 3 ongoing tactics for achieving equity. The first, for racial equity to be advanced, we must normalize discussions of race and racism, which are vital conversations to establish a shared understanding of organizational priorities and values. 2, organizing builds partnerships and mechanisms for engagement to get critical feedback. And this also supports the staff and partners that need to advance the work. This phase involves developing an internal infrastructure to address racial inequities. And 3, the operationalization of strategies. So using data and tools that advance racial equity. This phase provides staff and leadership with the tools they need to make conscious decisions that will advance equity. So reducing disparities and discrimination should be an explicit goal when accomplishing plans or programs. Next slide. So another way to advance structural equity would be addressing this through a whole government approach. with an understanding of institutional racism and structural systems that create social inequities or perpetuate these. There needs to be a cross-sector government collaboration to address the root causes of these disproportionate impacts. Pinellas County has used this whole government approach by adopting the Health in All Policies or HIAP initiatives. And this is a transformative approach towards addressing the systems, institutions, policies that create and reinforce unjust differences in exposure to environmental and natural hazards by considering health and equity in decision-making processes. Next slide, please. So knowing the need to address unjust environmental exposure, we understand that health should be also considered when addressing equity and resilience planning, because having access to quality housing, safe neighborhoods, good jobs, they all lead to a path to a healthy lifestyle and healthier communities. But depending on social determinants, there are systemic barriers or patterns that cause certain groups of people to not have access to a path of a healthy lifestyle due to institutional or structural racism. And there's data that proves that low to moderate income and people of color are usually those groups that are not able to go down that path. And the inability to get on this path leads them being more vulnerable before disasters even hit. These social determinants focus not on individual behavior, but as health in the whole context. So we need to achieve health equity by removing obstacles to health, such as poverty and discrimination, and their consequences, such as lack of good jobs and fair pay, quality education, housing, and safe environments. Next slide. So another part of my fellowship work was to also learn about homeownership and how that affects equity and resilience planning. And recently, the Tampa Bay Partnership published their 2020 Regional Equity Report. And to give a background on homeownership for the region, the report produced this figure that shows the racial makeup of Tampa Bay. And I wanted to highlight Manatee, Hillsborough, and Pinellas County for when we look at the disparities of homeownership next. But Hillsborough County has the highest percentage of Black and Hispanic residents. And I also wanted to highlight there are a small number of Asian residents in all counties for the region. Next slide. Many of you are familiar with the ALICE methodology developed by United Way, and this graph shows the percentage of households that are in the federal poverty category in ALICE. We also see that there are more Black and Hispanic ALICE households in Tampa Bay than white and Asian. Next slide. So when comparing homeownership in Tampa Bay to other cities and the entire country, Tampa Bay ranks third. But as we look at homeownership by race, we see that the numbers start to drop. So white homeowners in Tampa Bay are roughly around 75%. Asian homeowners go to 66%. You can click through, Kara, if you want. Hispanic homeowners drop to 51%, and Black homeowners land at 40% below the national average. And across the region, Black, Hispanic, and people that fall in the other category are much less likely to own their own home compared to white residents. Tampa Bay's gap between white and Black homeownership ranks 15th among the 20 competitive markets. This gap not only affects housing stability for these families, but it also affects the accumulation of wealth from one generation to next. While we also see that Black residents of Tampa Bay are more than 2 times as likely to be living in poverty compared to white residents. Next slide. And now looking at homeownership by county and race, we noticed that Manatee County has the highest racial disparity for Black homeowners. And this is followed by Pinellas and Hillsborough County, also for Black homeownership. So this disparity comes from the differences between percent white homeowners to the percent of Black, Asian, or Hispanic homeownership. In Tampa Bay, white, non-Hispanic, and Asian households have the highest home ownership rates. But and looking at the racial makeup of each county puts these disparities into perspective. So resilience planning needs to identify and document qualitative and quantitative data on racial inequities such as this, and develop plans based on where we are today to mitigate existing disparities. Next slide. Also, next we'll hear from Juanita Jones on equitable housing resilience. And I'll let her take it away.
Thanks, Simone. Good morning, everybody. I'm Juanita Jones. I'm a technical advisor with the Florida Housing Coalition. And so I wanted to use my sort of 2 minutes today to talk about just kind of how we distill all of this information and all the things that we're learning and that are being exposed by our conditions in the, I don't know if I want to call it amazing, but this weird year of 2020, right? And so bringing all of the things that we're talking about here today, what the REACH project is trying to do, and what obviously a number of the communities within this region are working on is truly community resilience and what that really means. So we pulled a definition that we thought was pointed enough, but also broad enough to encapsulate all of the many variables we continue to talk about. Community resilience is a measure of the sustained ability of a community to utilize its available resources to respond to, withstand, and recover from adverse situations. So this for us means we need to, kind of continue our efforts on as a collective and really start looking at all of us working together, because we really are all in it together. And there's no kind of you without me, if you will, if I can be cheesy about it. And so what I wanted to focus on, our organization is also a member of the Low Income Housing Coalition. And Kara, you can advance the slide. And there are I'm ahead of myself. Here, we're just kind of reinforcing the concepts and ideas that all of this has led to, which is that for the region, you have a housing deficit. You have a deficit in units of affordable housing to folks that are making 50% of area median income for this region and below. So that's an area that you can start to hone in on as you figure out what you want to do to start addressing things and changing the flow of the disparate impacts and disparities that we talk about. And so we can move to the next slide. 7 key principles of disaster housing recovery. So this is the information that I was talking about before that comes from the Low Income Housing Coalition. And I think that of all the things that I could say in all the ways I could say it, this really does encapsulate kind of a baseline for what we should all be thinking about as we go about our planning and improving our processes and the whole 9 yards, engaging with community. Everything is sort of wrapped into here. So if you'll bear with me, I'll read it, because I think these are words that I would say, everyone in need receives safe temporary housing where they can reconnect with family and community. There's nothing political about that. This is just humanity, right? Like when we have these devastating impacts, this is what everybody is trying to do, regardless of their circumstance before the devastation. This is still what they're trying to do: be safe and be housed and reconnect with their families first. That is what we do as a community. And we need to consider that as we figure out how we plan for specific tactical practices going forward. Securing help from government, it needs to be accessible, understandable, and timely. So the number of people that we know who don't get help because they can't get through the FEMA processes when disasters occur, because they don't have the paperwork that FEMA's constantly looking for, or the insurance company, the whole thing. Like, our efforts need to, at a baseline, help address the communities that continue to have this problem, not understanding how to work with the government and the government agencies that show up as the cavalry. Displaced people have access to the resources they need for as long as they need to safely and quickly recover housing, personal property, and transportation. Disaster rebuilding jobs and contracts are locally sourced whenever possible. So one of the things that I came across, which I think is a phenomenal example, and we'll add this stuff sort of to our housing checklist meetings with you guys next year, but is there are communities that when disasters occur and the government sends funding to those local neighborhoods and they're doing green infrastructure improvements and that kind of thing, they actually take the time to cultivate new laborers and employees from those neighborhoods. They build businesses to support that kind of infrastructure development or landscape development. Anything that has to do with rebuilding those neighborhoods or those parts of the community, they're going in and deeply ensuring that the local residents are able to take some, real personal and family household improvement in their incomes from those projects. So those dollars get to be recycled, and that's critically important. And then number 4, everyone is fairly assisted to fully and promptly recover through transparent and accountable programs and strict compliance with civil rights laws, with survivors having a say in the way assistance is. Sorry, this chat thing is right over my screen. With survivors having a say in the way assistance is provided. And I'm hearing you guys already talking about that. You're talking about how you get on the front end of this and do your community engagement and outreach, and how you bring the voices into the room that have the consistent issues of the disparities. So that's an important part of it in how we frame going forward. All homeowners are able to quickly rebuild and save quality neighborhoods of their choice. The discussion that Simone just had about the disparities in levels of rates of homeownership across this region. Same thing here. This is important that we look at it just from this simple standpoint. Renters and anyone experiencing homelessness before the disaster are quickly able to get quality, affordable, accessible rental property and save quality neighborhoods of their choice. So this again is about placement. As you go about, developing resources to rebuild affordable housing units that you lose in a storm, consideration about where you're putting those units. Are you just rebuilding in areas that are continuing to be in flood hazard areas because the sea level rise is changing and it moves the numbers, it moves the map line. And we need to really think more ahead of what we used to think. We used to be able to rely on that 100-year storm type number, but it's not reliable anymore because the nature of the climate change is advancing and really causing us to, we're kind of on our heels trying to figure out where is the safe ground, where is the higher ground. So those are things that we can use as sort of the baseline of our thinking as we're planning these programs and planning resources and how to allocate them. And then finally, all neighborhoods are free from environmental hazards, have equal quality and accessible public infrastructure, and are safe and resilient. At the end of the day, these 7 principles, I think, capture it all. They create kind of the best of the sauce, if you will, for all of the ingredients that are going into all of the work you guys are doing, all of the work that we're hoping to support you in. And so I just kind of wanted to leave it right there so that we can sort of marinate on these things as we get ready to go into the breakout sessions and really talk through, what it looks like to do the planning in your neighborhoods, in your communities, and what makes sense for you. And CJ is able to roll that up into what makes sense for this region. Thank you guys for listening.
Well, thank you, Juanita. That was it was really interesting and inspiring. I've seen this list before, but you really helped bring it alive for me. So now I have a much better understanding of it. And Simone, thank you for your great overview of the racial, social factors and the homeownership and renter thing. It was interesting to see that many of you had already perceived the issue of rentals. So we want to open it up to questions and conversation now, that we've heard this information, and so we'll go to a break in 15 minutes so we can really talk about what do you think this means and what should we do with all this info now in terms of regionalizing, operationalizing, and institutionalizing and all that good stuff. So I'm just going to pause while those of you with suggestions, if you feel more comfortable throwing it in the chat, that's great. I guess there's a problem raising your hand. You can just yell it out. It's a small enough group. Just yell, just say what you need to say. So
I wanted to add to this. So I found with trying to sell affordable housing to, whether it's elected officials or the public, that I think we really need to focus on making that strong connection with resiliency and sustainability, that affordable housing is a fundamental part of that. And I love that these key principles tie right into making that case, because we sometimes hear, well, we want sustainability, and we don't necessarily need to focus on affordable housing the whole time. We want to focus on sustainability, and so I think we really have got to make that push that they're one and the same in many instances.
Great, thank you for that comment. Linda raised her hand. Linda?
One of the challenges that we have in Pinellas County is that so much of our county is vulnerable to disaster, and particularly the beach communities. They're entirely in the coastal high hazard area. They're entirely flood prone. So one of the things that our emergency management department is proposing is, in areas where people are going to live anyway, it'd be great if we get everybody out of the flood zones, but we can't, to concentrate on building homes that are more resilient to return to after a disaster. Understanding everybody's going to have to evacuate, but to make sure those homes are still standing when they get back and still, livable. So that's something that we're looking at going forward.
So does that translate to changes to building design codes and recommendations?
Yes, right now, again, we're just kind of at the beginning of this conversation, but we're talking about for people who are going to increase densities in flood prone areas, that would be something that they would have to demonstrate that they're doing before that approval could be granted.
That's great. So I think that we've seen the city of St. Petersburg working on special, I would call standards for multifamily units. They are the same issue as you mentioned. It's a coastal high hazard area. So, the component of density is great. Multifamily increased resilience requirements. What does it mean to come back to a building after a point, right? So we talked a lot about, is there a potential for sheltering in place in some locations, not so many in Pinellas County, given the winds and the other risks in that. But for other cities and other counties, sheltering in place, because if you're low income, you can't just pack up and stay in a hotel for 5 days. It costs $500 to put plywood on your windows. So there's a lot of issues associated with short-term disasters, resiliency, and inequity to low-income families, right? Big, be prepared. So the cost of just stockpiling food, unless you're just living on rice and beans, right? So there's a lot of inherent preparedness recommendations that we make that are also not sensitive to true issues of inequity. So when we say food access and food security during disasters, that needs to look at specific levels of income and specific kinds of foods that can be provided, as opposed to just going, hey, pile into Publix and pay $40 for bottles of water. So how we develop and change our emergency preparedness recommendations, I think, can have an equity lens. So other folks, comments?
Susan has her hand up.
Great.
Yeah, just two real quick things is, I guess I was just struck at what Era said about sort of the multiple issues that interconnect. And I guess I'm struck at that as someone who's been more focused on climate and energy policy than a lot of you who work, for instance, with the Housing Coalition or homeless populations. I'm just struck at the multiple number of issues that you have to address, starting kind of at the earliest. I always go back to prenatal care, but there's education, there's the structures of the housing itself, there's financing. I keep thinking, I was reading about the idea of a climate bank, a green climate bank at the federal level, and there's some interest in that. And I thought, well, if there was real financing and a path to move people into some sort of home ownership, Thomas Friedman always said, no one washes a rented car. So you have these systemic things. I focus a lot on this high energy burden. And if you're paying $200 or $300 or $400 more a month on your electric bill because you're a renter and the landlord has no incentive, that's really systemic inequality and so forth. So anyway, I don't have the answer. I'm going to look to you guys, but I'm just struck at you know, to really make a difference in these communities. And it's worse in a disaster. There's just like 20 things that need to happen. And so how you kind of make all that happen at once. So the last thing I'll say is we can learn a lot from this pandemic. I watched an interview with a restaurant guy up in New York, and he just said, people aren't going to have a place to go back to work. So I think if we took that, maybe even just the restaurant industry in our region, and try to understand all the restaurants just that are going out, and how do you replace that? Like, what would be a workable system? You know, when the pandemic started and they were actually giving some money out, I thought, this is good. Just keep everybody doing something until we can piece it back together, right? But if there's no place for people to go to work, so it could be really interesting just to look at this current situation. You know, we have a disaster. So let's kind of figure out how that works in the chamber. And, you know, maybe, you know, Marianne from Mise en Place at the chamber, she is in the restaurant business. Maybe she'd be interested in helping think that through. So I'll shut up with those.
Now you bring up an interesting perspective is, you know, the aspect of income is what kind of jobs are going to be available in a disaster and post-disaster, and who gets employed, and how do you keep food on the table, and food supply chains are all.
And hurricane would be similar, really, if you think about it, right? The restaurants go down. I remember talking to a waitress in a diner after one of the hurricanes, and she's like, yeah, I was out for like 4 days. That is her electric bill and her rent. And, you know, I think the people in positions of power just don't understand that. Like, they can't even conceive of the fact that, you know, I missed 3 or 4 days of work and now I can't, whatever. I've been in politics, you know, my whole life, and it's its own animal. The president of the Senate is worth $27 million. He's an egg farmer, and, you know, sold a plot of land to Tico and made $4.4 million in just personal pocket on a solar farm.
So thank you, Susan. Thank you. So Doug, I wanted to touch base with you on what United Way's perspectives are on this, if you will.
Yeah, and it's a lot of the conversation that we were talking about with disaster, but I think the understanding that disasters don't have to just be your hurricanes. You know, especially when you're looking at housing for these individuals, disasters can be COVID, can be, you know, personal disasters as well, that I think are more common but less public. Right. We talk a lot about hurricanes and disasters that disrupt housing, and they do. And they're very public, and they come in and they can cause long-term damage. But there's also disasters that happen, I think, on an individual scale that also we can look at when we're talking about disasters, of individuals that, you know, they get sick and have a medical bill at the same time their car breaks down. Right. And this, you know, there was the slide talking about the ALICE threshold. And that's really when United Way talks about ALICE. It's those individuals who are above poverty, but still not making enough to pay those bills. And so when you're not able to do that, then, you know, you have to make sacrifices. And sometimes those sacrifices come to housing. And so when we look at talking about finding affordable housing and finding supports, you know, most of the people who are ALICE, again, ALICE is an acronym for asset limited, income constrained employed. The asset limited are individuals who don't have access to assets for the most part, and housing being typically individuals' largest asset. So most individuals that we're talking about are renters, right? And especially as we looked at the data, seeing the number of renters that are disproportionately people of color, disproportionately low income, and things like that, you're looking at a lot of individuals that when you're talking about affordable housing is really a rental community. And the trouble, and I really want to pull attention to what's happening right now with the rental community, in the most, you know, nowest of sense of the fact that we currently have the CDC declaration preventing evictions that are happening for the next 3 weeks. And without any extension, I believe it was the Aspen Institute did research stating about 30 to 40 million people will be evicted in the next few months if this doesn't take place. Locally, they do, the US Census has done surveys, and it's a housing pulse survey that happens every week. And so it changes, you know, from week to week. But I think most recent data said it ranges anywhere between 40 to 72% of all Floridian renters don't think that they'll either be likely or strongly likely they'll be evicted in the next 2 months. And this is important as it plays into housing, because you're talking about individuals where housing as it stands right now with the current stock and the current state, housing is a dream within a dream, right? These individuals are renters because they have to be. But I think it's important, and I want to bring up the conversation as we're looking at these concepts of affordable housing, is that, it doesn't have to be, it's just that's the state of where housing is, right? You look at those slides of the housing stock and 0 to 30% AMI. I mean, those were little slivers, right, that we were looking at. Because there's not a lot of housing stock, it simply is an impossibility for a lot of individuals. It doesn't have to be, but that's the case. That's of course not exclusive to us. We're not, unique in that effort, for better or for worse. But I think it is something to keep in mind as we're doing this work, that there is a lot of intersectionality between housing and every other aspect of an individual's life that I think we need to consider as we're building this up.
These are enormously complicated and interwoven issues on that. So we want to be respectful and let you get to break in about 5 minutes. I want to put a big lens on this. We're trying to absorb a lot of data to help us think about how to change our process. And that's part of the mission of requesting your participation in this, is to think about the different mechanisms that the region has, and within local government and within the regional action plan. What can we do that can make a bold statement, and that can also be very logical and practical? So one of the things that I was momentarily like, oh, if we could do this. So, the memorandum of understanding said, we'll develop a document, a plan. It also says use science. It also says engage businesses and communities. And we have to do that both locally and across the board regionally. But one of the things I was thinking about could it be awesome if we wholeheartedly adopted the 7 key principles, or somehow recognized an official mechanism to recognize the 7 key principles of disaster housing, as Juanita shared from the low income. Now, I can see everybody probably rolling their eyes, thinking about the work that it would take to be getting something like this adopted. But the idea is, bringing the sort of Bill of Rights, if you will, or strategic focus from other worlds, such as housing and disasters, helps to make this more concrete, right? So that could be something. So we want you to think about, what are the activities? Oh, Arrow, I see you have your hand up.
It was from before.
All right, you can still mention it. So I think you've covered a lot of things about how to integrate, how to change processes, and how do we talk about that, and how do we make a statement about that in terms of both the regional action plan. How do we build capacity? What are we building capacity for? Is it to plan first, to think about how to change the process, think about how to think? I don't know. How to document, how to monitor? What goes unmeasured, or what's measured badly or inaccurately, leads to bad decision making. So we set goals for new housing targets without understanding what we could potentially lose under different conditions. This is, sort of when I say, what do we know about those numbers, right? What do we need to do to keep up with growth? What do we need to do to replace things that are old and rickety and nasty and, not nice places for people to live? How do we not increase issues? So we spent a lot of time talking with, Bill and Andrea and Gladys and Doug and everyone about mobile home parks. Those are really super affordable. Some of them are nice. They're probably not really resilient. But if you read, and who owns what land, what property. So the region has a ton of mobile homes. So we know that as an issue of equity, kinds of housing have to be specifically addressed. It can't just be this generic housing, right? We have to think about who needs what kind of homes, and like a stepping path to resilient housing in the right way, in the right place. Daphne, you want to chime in on health related stuff or other ideas?
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Good
well,
morning.
Just listening to you guys talk and what you just mentioned, CJ, I just think that the kind of work that we're doing now with this action plan is definitely a good start. And as far as, building up our capacity around health equity, that's going to involve, I think one conversation piece was the need to have more racial conversations, the need to have more trainings around understanding race and those disparities around race that occur in our social determinants of health and in our neighborhood quality these days, and those impacts that neighborhood quality and housing quality has on health and mental health, just understanding that. So building up capacity can mean having trainings and having more systems like health and all policies, and those framework, local government. I think that that's important just to build awareness. That's a big key. And also helping people build capacity around these tools that are available to implement more equity considerations into our plans and our programs and our policies. I think that using more health equity assessments. Oh, I hope my connection, am I looking good right now? Can you guys hear me? My computer is always having connection issues. But using more racial equity assessments, using more health equity assessments, using more health planning matrices and checklists and so forth, just to make sure that when you're building up policies or programs or projects, plans and so forth, that you are considering health equity issues, and that also that you're able to agree upon them. Because like you said, like health, and health, housing, resilience, these topics, they have so many different things to consider, so many different variables that need to be considered. So, using these tools to, first outline those issues and also to come to agreement with them, to have that kind of shared idea of what all our issues are and putting them in front of us. That's always a first step, because it does involve having a number of partners who are involved. So if we are all in agreement on these issues, and then we all set up a tool or somewhat of a framework to consistently consider these issues as we do our work, and then evaluate our work in the end to make sure we're meeting the goals that we set in the forefront. That's definitely a start. So thinking about your partnerships, thinking about building capacity, and thinking about using these tools to consistently consider and then evaluate these health or resilient or equity issues. I think that health, equity, and resiliency are these topics that just always are in consideration of so many different variables. And that's just what I picked up being in HIAP this year, Health and All Policies. So just using those tools and getting into an agreement on what things to focus on is definitely a key thing to do.
Fantastic. Daphne, thank you for sharing that. You touched on a couple of things that I'm like, yeah, we need to do it. And then the question is how to do it. So I'm wondering, does HIAP have a roadmap we could just steal and change the words? I'm just kidding. The idea is you've been working through this intellectual process of integration, right? And so thank you, Simone, for sharing this and bringing this up. We support, what Simone's advocating is something that the council is really working to gain more knowledge of and get behind. So first, I want to say that, we think that many of you are members of the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network or the Florida Sustainability Directors Network. So first, we'd like to assure that we've got, this support to use and continue to refer to the USDN. Because I think that's establishing common roadmaps is a way to help get all of us in terms of planners understanding things. So for those of you who work in local governments, do you feel like leveraging the USDN is a good approach to help us start?
I'll start off and say I think so. I'm happy I'm on this meeting today because I'm just learning about that network and that tool. But I would say, having that as a template to start off on is ideal, because then you can work with it and, adapt it as needed to fit our own issues in the county. So I would say yes.
Okay. Hank and Laura, what do you guys think? Sheridan?
I'll go a step further and say if we do use it and let them know, they could probably participate and provide technical assistance, or will want to. Ooh. So I think it's a good move.
Great.
we are in the fledgling process of getting that off the ground. So like I said, we're planning on a 2-year process, and we're in month 1.5 really. So
Awesome. Any other folks looking at sustainability and the USDN or SDN? I know there's a variety of members. I tried to be, they won't let the Regional Planning Council in. So I talked to Meg Jameson though. So it's only for local governments. But we think that they do great work. And I like your idea, Hank, of potentially identifying how we might recognize that framework in a more structured approach. Maybe that's a goal somebody can draft in your breakout session, like how we would better engage USDN to better help us with our process. And this aspect of capacity building, I would like some more attention to that, either in goals or brainstorming, because there's different sectors of capacity building that need attention. I think from a housing to nonprofit service sectors, a lot of stuff. So I've got a couple hands raised, I'll stop. Maggie, we haven't heard from you. Thank you for raising your hand.
Hi, how's everyone doing? Thanks, CJ. So I have been listening excitedly and attentively to everything that everybody's saying. And I'm a brick and mortar person. So my background is in building affordable housing. And the health and all, the HIAP ideas are so exciting. And I want to throw out there, so CJ, you were talking about mobile homes, and that's what got me on this kick of thinking about the quality of housings. If we're talking about building equity in communities and building wealth, I think it's worth considering the long-term effects of building a mobile home versus a brick and mortar house that will, because mobile homes, they have declining value. They don't have, it's not the kind of a structure that you want to put a family in the long term. So at the risk of sounding myopic, I think it might be interesting to look at some of the building communities and the development communities, sustainability and resiliency standards. The AIA is starting to take a stronger stance on it. And I just want to throw that out there, that I think that's worth incorporating or hearing from those communities as far as building equity and sustainability.
AIA being the American Institute of Architects?
Yeah. And they're, I honestly don't think they're aggressive enough on these issues, but they're starting. And I think holding them accountable and having them, there are some other sustainability and building groups and certifications that are a little more aggressive. And I think it's worth having your eye on that, as well as the kind of balancing walking the line between big picture planning and social equity, as well as just talking about how we need more houses. The cost of living will not go down as long as there aren't more houses being built. So,
Thank you, appreciate that. So I want to ask, and I made some notes here, we can follow up on that. So we want to get people into the breaks and then come back for breakout groups. So Daphne, did you have one last comment? You saw your hand was raised, so.
Sorry, no, that was from earlier.
Okay. Well, I just want to say again, thank you to Juanita and Simone for helping us learn so much about different aspects of social determinants of health and have some focused areas of what to talk about.